Let's take a look at our new Traditional Cathedral Window Quilt blocks, which can be made into a quilt or a cushion. So there's two blocks, and this first block is what we call the inner block, which we make one of, where we make three of the second block. We're tacking down our batting, trimming back to our seam allowance or our stitching line 1 to 2 millimeters away, and then we're placing our first piece of fabric. We're just using denim. Stitch that down into position. Putting in the registration marks after the quilting pattern or the redwork pattern has been done. Those registration marks are to line up our next piece of fabric. So take a piece of fabric at suggested cut size and then press it diagonally so as you have the bias of all the stretch of the fabric along the fold. Line up with the registration marks and then open the piece of fabric out and then stitch it into position. We're going to trim this back again to our stitching line, just trimming along the fold line at the top and the start at the end. Lightly finger press it into position and then stitch around the perimeter areas. So that creates a little envelope of sorts. Again, second piece, registration marks, open the fabric up, stitch the side and the top of this piece, trim our fabric back to our stitching, and then stitch into position. Our second block, which we'll be making 3 of, same similar way, stitching our batting down, stitching our placement line for our first piece of fabric, stitch this into position, excuse those loopy perimeter stitches. Our red work is done. Then we put registration marks just on one side, so top and bottom, and this is the side that we're going to, the side closest to us is where we're going to lay our piece of folded fabric against the registration marks, open it up, stitch in position, as we did for the first block. The scissors we're using in this particular project that Katie is using is they're called canary scissors. They're called armrest curved blade, put out by Matilda's Own. They're made in Japan. They're for people that have a little bit of arthritis in their hands, a little bit easier to work with. Don't know how readily available they are outside of our region. Now we're going to do a layout. We're going to create rows, starting with our first row, joining our first seam together, stitching just inside the outer stitching line, being careful to match the top and the bottom so as they are even, especially the laid on fabrics. There we have our first row joined. Repeat for the next row. as you'll see with the layout, we have 16 blocks, but we only make 4 of those central first blocks that we showed. We only make 4 of those, and those are 4 centers. 3, 4. Now we're going to join our rows. Open the seams up and press firmly. All the seams nicely opened. Pin or use quilt clips to actually put seam on seam. Then we're going to stitch that seam. Again, making sure that the intersections and junctions of the open seams fall on top of each other perfectly. Stitching just inside the perimeter stitching line of the blocks, just make sure those all match. Again, attach our next row. And our last row. Open the seams up. And we've got a couple of foldy seams which we can either clip or press into the area. Doesn't really matter which, as long as the intersection is not too bulky, it does not matter. Press our backing fabric. Oh, it's not our backing fabric, it's our first insert for our joined blocks. We're putting a piece of steamer seam onto this fabric which had a pattern. So the steamer seam light 2 that we're using, so we stick that on and give it a light press. Then we're trimming the block up so as that the pattern is central and back to the size we want. And we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So those fabrics will sit in the middle of those joined blocks. Let's pull the paper off and stick that into position so as that the seam allowances are even all the way around. It should be point onto seam, the point of this fabric onto the seam join line and pressed into position. So we're using a product called Steamer Seam Light 2. You can use a heat and bond. You don't have to use anything. You could spray with quilt based. It's up to you. We just thought that this might keep everything together a little bit easier. Now we're pressing back the lip of the beigey bone fabric and pressing it so it represents the shape of the stitching underneath. So it's coming back so as that we can just see the shape of the stitching underneath. It's a guideline. Try and keep those shapes so as they're all the same. They need to be all the same width, varying out to nothing at the end. So you can just see a row of stitching underneath that edge, folded edge, and that's what we're following, like a template. So we are going to edge stitch the fold. When I say the fold of that first fabric, not the fabric not the lap we've just turned over. We're stitching on that first bias fold of that first piece of fabric we laid down on our blocks. Just edge stitching, so just the needle width in from the edge. We're using a patchwork sole, which is a 1/4 inch or 1/8 inch patchwork sole, and this brand is actually a Dukey foot of all brands. It's perfect for the job, great for edge stitching and understitching. Quite universal in its fit as well, so just has a slightly wider opening where the needle is. It allows you to edge stitch quite comfortably. Big believer in having the right foot for the job, and as much as everyone has their favourites, I like to chop and change. We're just stitching to the point. Give them a light press. So you should be able to just put your fingertip under the edges of those windows, and you'll just see the fabric and the pattern continue underneath them. Spray based our backing onto the quilt. Then, because of the nature of this particular design, we can only really stitch in the ditch between all thicknesses for a very short distance on each quarter. And it's that seam that's been joined our first lot of blocks together. We don't have much choice about how far we can stitch because the rest of the seams are being covered by the coloured insert of the cathedral window. Let's just true this up and trim our backing back to our 1/2 inch seam allowance. And let's cut our binding. Our binding is about 3 inches wide. You can cut your binding to whatever you wish to use your technique or your measurement that you want to use. We're using about 3 inches. Cross our cut strips at right angles. Draw a diagonal line between our 2 step points. Pin together, and then stitch. You can use a walking foot for this, or you can just use the patchwork style, whatever you wish. We're trimming this back to a shy quarter. It can be a 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch, 3/8 inch, whatever you wish. And then we're just going to open that seam up with the tip of the iron. Joining on the bias means that it reduces bulk. Now let's fold our bias strip in half so it's wrong sides together, and we'll be folding widthways. And there we go. There is our binding done. Now let's just fold our end down on the bias. So one end we need to follow our instructions as in your notes and do it exactly the same way. So we need to be at this fold, cut bias, trim off to that fold, leaving a 3/8 or 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then fold that back into position. This is our starting point. Follow our instructions and our note about where we pin to. We have strategic pins for different places. So our first pin is in an inch in from the point, second is 3 inches, and our third pin is 2 inches. But follow the diagram in the notes. So we start by doing a little tack at the beginning, and then we start putting our binding on. So it's a 1/2 inch seam, so we want the stitching line to be covering our perimeter stitching. We come to our net corner, 1/2 inch, 1/2 inch, and then turn to our corner and stitch out diagonally. That means that we've got a diagonal line to follow, which we pull back, and then we make a pleat at the top, and then we start again. If you start on the fabric and reverse back, it's less likely for the machine to hesitate. This can be done with a walking foot as well, especially if you've got a bit of your fabric's got a bit of stretch in it. Now, having the walking foot to help this through is definitely an advantage. Again, stitch to our net, diagonal to the corner, fold up, finger press, clip in, and then down we go again. 1/2 inch seam. Onto the home stretch. And we want to stop at our pin. Trim off our binding so as it's just covering our fold of our diagonal fold. Then we want to trim off a skerrick from that outside edge so as we just tuck this binding inside itself, inside the channel, and clip that into place, and then put a pin in position and then stitch from where we left off. Let's press all our binding out from the right side. Press it firmly, lots of steam. Now returning to the right, to the underside, press our binding over. Put some clips in to hold that pressing, and then fold our mitre in. We use our phones to take the photographs for our notes, so that's why you'll see a phone appear in our project from time to time. They just get in the way, especially when you're filming, because you need to be doing both at the same time. And just work your way around, take your time. More time taken at this part of the project than there means a better finish. Now all we need to do is just edge stitch on the front binding, work our way around the perimeter, sink our needle, pivot, carry on. Again, walking foot can be helpful here, or the patchwork sole is working very well. That trench in the front of that sole is just wide enough to sit on the groove of the binding, so it looks perfect when it's being stitched. Almost at the home straight. Then we are complete. One more block and we are done. Trim up, press, and we have a quilt.